Greetings all on this bank holiday weekend. It's Sunday afternoon, and we ran a webinar yesterday, and we got the maximum registrants possible, 500, so we were maxed out. And I recorded it all, my presentation with Gabor Erdosi, our discussion with Dr. Michael Eades, the legendary author of Protein Power, and we had Q&A session at the end. So it's kind of like sitting back and watching a movie, and the topic is bad science. And we pretty much went in, I believe, and eviscerated that topic. So really entertaining, I think very enjoyable. Enjoy it now for free. And I'll catch up with you at the end.
Today's webinar is free for the public, and we're going to go through bad science. So essentially, in metabolicduo.com, myself and Gabor decode all the complex science and translate it into solutions for weight loss, health, longevity, productivity for our subscribers. Here today, we'll just point out some really amusing stuff about bad science, because half the literature is filled with the latter. So I'm going to kick it off with a share screen, and if you'll just give me one moment. Okay, so we'll kick it off. Medical shenanigans exposed. They were Gabor's words, and he pulled together most of these slides, actually. I'm going to go through some, then Gabor will go through some, and then we'll switch back and forward. So Mike Eades, delighted. Dr. Michael Eades has joined us because he's an expert in cognitive bias and confirmation bias and all the biases we can fall into, and also, of course, in the biases within the scientific literature and studies, often which reflect more funders' desires than what the actual data says. So we're going to look at some examples. Okay, a motto: nothing makes sense in biology without considering evolutionary adaptation and context. And one of our big problems in the scientific literature is context is not taken into account, or context is actually avoided if there's a certain message that's desired and a lot of money has gone into a study expecting a certain outcome. Context can hit the wall. Animals, humans are adaptive organisms. Very few physiological parameters that are carved in stone where there's a state of normality. It depends on the context. So I'm going to give you a classic example. What's a normal blood glucose? You'd say, well, 4.5 to 5.3 millimole, or around 90 milligram. But that depends on the context. This classic study got people who are quite overweight to fast for around 2 months. And then they went in and not only saw that they had a very low blood glucose, which would be perceived as hypoglycemic, but they actually injected them with a little bit of insulin, and they pushed their blood glucose down to as low as 0.5 millimole. Now, in normal circumstances for a human, that's death, or at least a deep coma. But in these people, not only did they demonstrate sub 1 millimole glucose, which should mean they're in a coma, but they didn't even feel ill effects. And the reason is, of course, after a long period of fasting, the glucose that's required for your brain and your red blood cells, it is critical for those, drops right down, and beta hydroxybutyrate, a ketone body, becomes the fuel when you're very fasted. Therefore, you can drop your glucose to the floor and nothing happens. So it's a great illustration of context within parameters, physiological parameters. Now, disclaimer, Gabor wrote this. I probably wouldn't bother because I'm kind of a hard ass. The presentation is not intended to attack science generally, who are researching the topics mentioned. Much of the relevant base in science and research is important, and most of it generally was done without bad intentions or agendas. However, some research is indeed preposterous, and the topics are generally given a spin by the tribes or food or pharma shills. And we're going to look at some of that. So first, a list of the bad science topics. We won't cover them all. LDL and ApoB, the ApoBB bullet theory, as the main cause of atherosclerotic coronary vascular disease. That's been much abused in the literature for 4 or 5 decades. Dietary cholesterol is a major determinant of blood cholesterol levels. That was absurd from the start. Even Ansel Keys knew that, and he's not exactly a good guy. And the idea that blood cholesterol single-handedly or mainly drives coronary vascular disease. There was a cholesterol consensus panel in the early 80s with the National Institutes of Health, And they actually joined all the scientists together, knocked out the guys who were a problem, and they aligned that blood cholesterol was the biggest driver by far of cardiovascular disease. And we know now that that's nonsense. Specific animal compounds, and there'll be a theme here today, animal food compounds cause chronic diseases. Who'd have thought? As I think Mike yourself said, 90+% of paleoanthropologists who are worth their salt would acknowledge we evolved, Homo sapiens, by access to organ meats and scavenging. We evolved from animal foods. You know, they are us. And yet, everyone wants to try and find any inkling to say that animal foods cause disease. I wonder why. But anyway, choline, carnitine, TMAO, new 5GC, which Gabor will go through. These are the classics. And I think these ones form kind of exemplars of what we're talking about in bad science. So we're going to use these quite heavily to illustrate the problems. Artificial sweeteners, I'm going to do a bit on that in the end. The recent erythritol scare. Erythritol causes heart attacks. Who'd have thought? Well, someone thought about it. And meat causes everything from diabetes to heart disease. I mean, it's just a farce at this stage, and many, many more. So LDL and ApoB, we did a deep dive in our first Metabolic, duo.com, open Zoom with all our subscribers and Q&A. We really went into that in detail. And the summary is atherosclerosis is a major human killer and non-resolving inflammation is a prime suspect. So we kind of illustrated that single excellent paper kind of was bang on the money. Less the LDL, more the inflammatory drivers. TMAO, I'm going to do a whirlwind tour of TMAO. And if you're not aware of this, TMAO is a massive new driver of heart disease, the TMAO blood levels, apparently. And it got covered by all the media, came out of Cleveland Clinic, all this work, studies in Nature and Cell. I mean, in the top journals. We're going to go through and take a closer look at them. So the problem is, even in high quality studies on their surface, the representations in TMAO are that mechanisms and causation are settled, and they're not. And I'll show you. Another factor that correlates with both parameters, like the disease and the TMAO levels, is not considered. Doesn't even get mentioned. You know, the confounding factors. Reverse causation is not entertained or looked at. You know, that the TMAO may not be driving the disease, but rather the disease is driving up the TMAO. Not entertained in any of these studies for reasons that will become obvious. This paper came out in Cell, I mean, a preeminent journal. And you can see from the diagram here on the right, it's case closed for these guys. Yeah, the gut microbiome produces TMAO from certain foodstuffs, primarily or more so. And that goes to your liver, or TMA actually, and your liver then makes TMAO, and then that drives all of these problems. So they're basically claiming mechanistic chain, cause and effect, and they're with no shame whatsoever. But let's look. So often unrealistically high or supraphysiological doses are used in these experiments and papers to try and get a result. And that's kind of fraudulent. So to give an example here, and this is from LabCorp, the ranges for humans, less than 6.2 micromolar is low, 6.2 to 9.9 is moderate, and high is above 9.9 or 10. So remember, that's really high for a human, apparently, from LabCorp. But then look at a study like this that shows up until 10 and over, and even up to 30, right, level of TMAO. There's no real signal, right, in this Petri dish, platelets, clotting type experiment. There's no real signal for any real change. And you can see that on the right and the left, unless you get way up into supraphysiological doses in this laboratory level experiment. But the paper breathlessly claimed to have shown how thrombosis occurs and it's TMAO, right? So that's one big problem. And the evidence that doesn't support certain narratives, right, is usually ignored. And there's no question about that. These papers I'm showing on the screen, all of them indicate potentially positive effects of TMAO levels, right? And even that TMAO is a marker for metabolic syndrome. So remember we said reverse causality? This team went through and correctly pointed out that TMAO in the blood is a marker of metabolic syndrome, which is driven by sugar and vegetable oils, right? So you can see the irony here. The TMAO is being used to vilify certain foods, but the reality is the TMAO is a marker for a problem caused by completely different foods, okay? And you can see there dietary choline or TMAO effectively does not influence atherosclerosis development. So all of this science is ignored when you're pursuing a narrative. And here's some more as well. You know, clearly benefits to TMAO are indicators of it not being linked causally to atherosclerosis. And this other study, whether healthy or unhealthy diets, they note that TMAO can go up at both, even though one diet set is clearly healthy. So they're questioning, but this is all ignored. And there's a couple more here. Metabolism of visceral adipose tissue. TMAO regulated the metabolic status of the visceral adipose tissue in these rat studies, reducing lipogenesis and improving fatty acid composition. So now you can see that maybe the TMAO is elevated in metabolic syndrome, and maybe like omega-7 fats that are elevated in metabolic syndrome, they can have a somewhat beneficial effect, the opposite of what the media would say, and likewise an endothelial function. So I don't want to delve too deep here. It's a broad audience, but you can see that this massive host of science is ignored because it doesn't fit what certain authors are looking for. This one here is a killer, and I remember going through it a few years ago. TMAO is strongly related to renal function. Now think of kidney or renal function as diabetes type 2, right? It's almost synonymous. So they noted that the TMAO levels in the blood go very high in kidney or type 2 diabetes patients, not related to what they're eating, but it goes related to their disease state. So you know what this crowd did? Excellent. They monitored after transplant of kidneys. And what they noted, which is a killer, when they transplanted to a new kidney without changing anything else or diet or anything else, the huge TMAO levels in the blood collapsed down to normal, same as controls. In other words, they proved the reverse causality, that the TMAO was a marker of insulin resistance type problems. And if you fix those, in this case by transplanted kidneys, the TMAO goes right down. Nothing to do with diet. So that essentially, that's a case closed. So that's kind of a case closer now. And hopefully you'll appreciate that. So we're going to go from Ivor talking about TMAO to Gabor talking about the other anti-meat study realm, which is new 5GC, which is a sugar that you sometimes consume relating to red meats. So Gabor, are you still with us or alive?
Yeah, I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, you're good.
I apologize for my camera. It's Murphy's Law that when you get a new branded T-shirt for Metabolic Duo and you want to show off, then your camera stops working. So this is kind of normal and expected. Just a little bit of introduction to this compound, new 5GC. It's a sugar type of molecule. It's called glycan, and you know these glycans cover all of our protein molecules or most of our protein molecules in the body, and they behave as antigens, so the immune system can react to the different sugar molecules attached to the proteins. And one of these, just a side note that blood groups also work based on these kind of exotic sugars. And one of these is this new 5GC, which it seems that humans lost in evolution quite some time ago. And why did humans lose this if it can cause every kind of problem now? The reason is, at least this is what scientists speculate or hypothesize about, was that this sugar molecule interacts with viral infections, and what happens is that some viruses exploit when this sugar molecule is present on our cells, and they can cause much more severe disease. In our past, sometime hundreds of thousands of years ago, we lost it, and it was so successful that all people who did not lose this sugar molecule kind of died out. So probably there was some viral infection emerging or some other infectious disease, and wiped out everybody who still had this sugar. So what's happening now is a much more interesting question. The important thing is that we lost this molecule, and when we consume it from the diet, we react to this sugar attached to the proteins in the diet as it was a foreign molecule. So the immune system produces antibodies, for example, to this molecule. Do I need to click on something? Oh no, it's coming now from Ivor. So what happens is that when we eat a lot of meat, or we eat very little meat, it has an impact on the microbes in our guts. And it turns out that when we eat a lot of meat, the bacteria in our gut can convert these sugar molecules into kinds which we recognize, which we do recognize, our immune system recognizes that sugar, and there is no serious immune response. The problem is when you eat little meat or eat meat together with other foods which cause a substantial shift in the microbial composition. And then the example is in the text on the right hand side, that Bacteroideales and Clostridiales are two big groups of bacteria colonizing the human gut, and these can significantly drop in our diet, and these are responsible for converting this sugar. These are mostly the responsible bacteria. And guess what drops on a Western diet, a Western type diet? These two precisely. And what goes up is another type of group of bacteria, the firmicutes. And when you consume, for example, a lot of simple sugars like refined starches and sugary stuff, basically added with topped with vegetable oils and different added fats, these two drop, and you kind of lose your ability to convert this now foreign type of sugar attached to the dietary proteins. And the effect is that the immune system starts recognizing this protein in higher amounts as foreign and attacks it, and inflammation is directly involved in most risk factors known for atherosclerosis and even in cancer. So the problem is diet again, and not really the compound. Normally this won't cause any issues. And there are studies out there which show that even with diet, the sugar levels or the antibody levels produced attacking this sugar do not change, neither with age. So that's very peculiar, because normally with age your exposure to these antigens, to this sugar attached to meat, for example, meat proteins, with age the exposure increases, so the antibodies in your blood also tend to increase. But the authors observed no change with age nor with diet. That's very, very interesting. But later they note, just under the red line, I highlighted the text, that what actually was associated with increased antibody levels was previous vaccination history and the geographic region in which the individual spent his or her childhood. So again, it seems that we are a little bit clueless about what's going on, but already some authors, and not to mention the newspapers, they put a spin on a single molecule that this causes cardiovascular disease through some purported mechanisms. But actually, when we look at it, the problem is that Western diet can increase the levels, yes, but these levels do not really change with diet at all, and the associations go with things completely unexpected, like vaccination history and geographic region. So we are totally clueless. But you keep hearing these messages from mainstream media that meat consumption, which contains these glycans, these sugar molecules attached to the proteins, to proteins in meat, will kill you through increasing your risk of cardiovascular disease. So what happens usually in the scientific literature, and what I do when I do my searches for good studies, is that there are these associational studies, when they try to look at two or several things and how they go together in large numbers of people. But many of these studies are actually done by so-called food frequency questionnaires, when they ask people about what they had for breakfast, lunch, and dinner last week, last month, and last year. And of course, nobody remembers, and people also tend to adjust a little bit that, my diet is not so unhealthy. I know that red meat is bad and Coke is bad and different things, what perception people have, and then they a little bit alter the input. It was shown that the inaccuracy of these FFQs, the food frequency questionnaires, is between 20 to 40%. So these surveys include a uncertainty of 20-40% normally, and then very often these studies do not measure or do not do any more of these questionnaires, just one at baseline, and then they assume that 10 or 15 years later you are still consuming the same inaccurately reported diet, which is of course usually not true. But they go ahead and keep reporting effect sizes between, normally like 10% increase or 12% increase risk of whatever disease, or 19% of increase in whatever disease. Note that the input contains higher inaccuracy than the effect size what the authors report. So I just totally ignore these types of studies unless there is at least 50% increase in whatever risk, or 50% reduction or something like that. Because otherwise what we are dealing with is just squeezing and torturing large data. And if you have a large enough data, you can find basically anything you want with different statistical adjustments. And it goes without saying that I apply the same approach even if the results confirm my own views or biases or what I would like to show. So I just completely exclude all these associational questionnaire-based studies if the effect size is below this 40%, which is the upper threshold of inaccuracy introduced by the method of obtaining the data. Talking about mechanisms, so we talk about meat and red meat and how it could increase the risk of cardiovascular disease or diabetes, cancer, and more chronic diseases. There are some mechanisms which may be involved here. For example, it's usually the mentioned compounds TMAO or NuG5C and these animal derived compounds. But it can be, for example, iron. Iron metabolism is strongly linked to metabolic syndrome, and metabolic syndrome is kind of the root of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancer, and so on. So what happens is that iron metabolism is also kind of involved or closely linked to metabolic syndrome, where your macrophages sequester iron away some purported infection or infiltration of microbes. and then it's involved in local inflammation, and that closely linked to the same mechanisms. But these mechanisms are mostly theoretical. So the experimental evidence derived from humans is scarce, and I must say that is usually unconvincing. Please move on. This is one of our favorite graphs. Of course, this is also not a very accurate data. It doesn't closely represent consumption. I think it's based on agricultural production and disappearance. So how much meat is produced and then disappears. Some of it ends in the trash bin. The most part we do consume, but the difference, what you see here, the correlation is so much against these agendas that, for example, red meat causes diabetes, that it's simply impossible that you have this amount of uncertainty or inaccuracy in your input data. You actually see a reverse correlation here, even if it's totally neutral and your data is showing some inaccuracies, that there is absolutely no correlation, or even there is a reverse correlation between these two parameters. How anybody can claim that red meat causes diabetes, or it's a leading major factor in causing diabetes is anybody's guess. I think it must have some spin on this, because otherwise no sober farmer, as we say locally, no sober farmer would come out with this common sense or nonsense with any common sense.
Yeah. Hey, thanks, Gabor.
Okay, let's move on with Ivor now.
Yeah, you're back to me. I'm sorry, guys, but there you go. Erythritol. Now, this one is not maybe so important, but I think it's a beautiful example or exemplar of what we're talking about. And this went all over the media around a month ago. I'm not interested in sweeteners, to be honest, but I kind of had a look, and it took me 5 minutes to realize it was more nonsense. Not proven to be nonsense, but I'll give you the logic. So it came out of Nature Medicine. Ooh, very nice. No wonder it went all over the world in one day. And it's the idea that erythritol will cause cardiovascular events. And I thought, whoa, it doesn't make any sense. It's not really metabolized. It's endogenously produced in small quantities. It just didn't make any sense. So I looked into it. So here you go. Cleveland Clinic, and this will come back at the end. The Cleveland Clinic, they're pretty big offenders for this stuff. So here's the data, and first thing I noticed was, wow, the guys they looked at were sick, heart attack problem people in their 60s in the US. And they showed that the highest quartile of blood erythritol levels had, a risk multiplier of around 2.7 for having a heart attack. Okay, then. But they also included another cohort where they had tested their blood levels back in 17 or 18. And in Europe, these were 70-something-year-old, very metabolically ill people with heart problems. But again, they saw the top quartile in erythritol in their blood, had a 4.3 kind of hazard ratio or risk multiplier. Now, I thought that was interesting from the get-go. So they did measure their blood, but back when the time when there wasn't too much erythritol action going on, it's more a recent keto thing. And the authors of this study also called out that a lot of keto people, are taking erythritol. So you could see there was a keto thing going on there. It was kind of an anti-keto study in a roundabout way. But you see this 4.3 risk multiplier for the older guys and a lower 2.7 for the 60-something-year-olds in the US. There's a kind of a giveaway there, because when they adjusted for other cardiac risk factors and problems, independent ones, what we saw was that the risk fell right down to around 1.8 to 2 for both, which is kind of getting into the noise, the 2x multiplier. So when you correct for real stuff, the association falls away. So that was interesting. And also the older, sicker guys showed more of a hazard ratio in the unadjusted. And that kind of indicates it's more to do with the state of the person and what else they're doing than the erythritol per se. Looks like confounding. So that's one way you can read studies. Now, if we look closer at it, basically here is where I had the arrows I'd forgotten, showing that when you correct for the other issues, the risk multiplier collapses a lot. And that's kind of a tell or a show that there's major confounding going on. But the other thing I noticed was, hold on a minute, the low cardiovascular disease people were 4 micromolar in the blood test, and the high, supposedly high due to erythritol, were 6. Now, they're tiny differences. I mean, erythritol must be plutonium or pure nuclear waste to be able to leverage such a huge risk from going up a couple of micromolar. So there's another little tell that doesn't really make sense to someone like me who's read thousands of papers. It just doesn't fit. And then we'll look, because a lot of people, even good people in our network, kind of thought this was convincing because they did the blood measurements years ago and then tracked the people. So that's kind of associational. And then they did a challenge with humans where they got a handful of them and gave them ice cream with erythritol and looked at their blood levels rise. And then they did laboratory studies. So it looked like, oh, all these different forms of science are all agreeing. So this is pretty convincing. Well, hold on your horses there. So on the left is what I showed you. That's the associational study from looking at the blood levels. 4 to 6 millimolar was seen. And then they gave them ice cream with erythritol, and they got up to 7,000 millimolar, sustained for days. Now, hold on a minute here, right? And the thing is, these low levels in the blood for all this study back here, clearly they were not eating any erythritol, or they would have hit upon loads of people with huge levels, but they didn't, right? They're all low. And also, these are old heart disease patients, the last people who be eating keto-friendly, erythritol-laden foods, especially back in 2018, right? So nothing adds up. There's a massive disparity. And the two wings of their study, in a way, jettisoned their study, in a way, whereas a lot of people viewed this as, wow, it's corroborative, you know, that these different ways of looking at the science are strengthening the result. So you got to be really careful with this stuff. Now, why might the erythritol, through reverse causation, actually have an association with coronary vascular disease? Because there was an association. Let's be fair. Well, erythritol comes from the pentose phosphate pathway. It's endogenously produced by humans, right? Not in huge amounts, but in the small amounts we saw in their study, okay? So there's maybe. And why might the higher erythritol from this endogenously produced source in the body by humans, why might it associate with cardiovascular disease? Well, there's one good reason that I found. Because this pathway is driven by eating real sugar and crap. That's why. So it's not too surprising we see an association between low levels of erythritol that are elevated in a human when you get those kind of elevated levels by eating sugar, which does cause heart disease, like nothing else. So I think you might see the problem here. None of what I've said was touched upon or even acknowledged by the Cleveland Clinic authors. It wasn't even held up as a potential, as far as I recall. So I mentioned Cleveland Clinic was important. And the thing is that Stanley Hazen is the author, and he has form, and the Cleveland Clinic has form. Because we went through TMAO a while ago, half an hour ago, and we showed how it was kind of nonsense. But guess where TMAO came from almost exclusively? From this researcher and from the Cleveland Clinic. So these guys have form. TMAO, LMAO. That's what we were all saying at the time. It's just farcical, as hopefully we've illustrated. This guy is interesting because we see here in an interview he did, and I'm just underlining in red, he's all about meat being a problem, right? Bias, anyone? And he's all about meat being a problem. And it looks like they direct all of the research towards anything that might misleadingly show meat to indeed be a problem. So this is classic bias. I'm not too sure about the funding, but I'm guessing there's some connections there too. But I mean, I can't prove that. Now, I'm going to show you something really funny, because this afternoon, myself and Gabor were chatting about this webinar. We were talking about this guy and the funding and all, and we were just having a chat and messaging. And Gabor went off to check out, well, what is the funding? And is there any other linkages? And he comes back to me 20 minutes later. You know the study we showed at the start of this webinar, where this convincing study in Cell journal showed that it was a given that TMAO drove this problem? Guess who authored it? The same guy. Gabor already discovered that this afternoon. So it's kind of like you're going into a nest of vipers here. And without being overly critical, you know, anyone with a logical or a kind of a cynical brain will say that this thing is a setup. And the funding Gabor grabbed as well. And it's just the usual, you know, a whole load of pharma and all the usual suspects. And they have ownership of patents relating to the testing for TMAO and the you know, its use as a biomarker, yada, yada, yada. I mean, this is just business, I would suggest. And Gabor then found that yet another paper in separate searches looking at gut microbiome and cardiovascular disease, he popped up again this afternoon. And this one is attacking protein as a cause of cardiovascular disease. Meat protein, of course. Okay. So there you go. It's a bit of a wash. I'm only going to mention one more because we need to get talking to Mike about all this madness. But this hyperdose vitamin D, I just thought was so funny back in 2013 when I gave the vitamin D debacle talk. It got very popular. And I called it out. And essentially, back then there were studies that were giving, you know, a few thousand international units a day would be reasonable. And the half-life of vitamin D3, the supplement you take in the blood, is a day or two. And then your liver converts it into 25-OHD, which is a more active metabolite. But obviously, there's no point putting in more than a few thousand, or maybe 10,000, because your body can't process it fast enough. But look at the studies. And this one is actually 21. The ones I found from 2010 and 2012 gave 500,000 IU in an injection once a year in a study of elderly people to see would it help them, you know, with bone strength and breakages. 500,000 once a year with a half-life of a day or two. I mean, you'd almost wonder, is that stupidity or is that malice? And we can't say. But when I Googled it just to grab the study quicker than going back to my big archive, I saw a 2021 study came out, and the same thing, they're still at it. 100,000 IU in an oral supplement every quarter. That was their study to see would it benefit. And I mean, these are almost designed, whatever your belief about vitamin D supplementation or otherwise, these are designed to give a certain negative result. So the summary, I think we'll switch back to Gabor, if you're still there, Gabor. And
yeah, I'm still listening, not sleeping.
Good.
Yeah, I think the major messages were that, well, I put some of the generated science, but I think these days we can say that most of the generated science, at least in medical and life sciences, is junk, and it's a little bit difficult to sail all these studies coming out. If you go back 40, 50 years, it's not so bad. So I just love older studies, because there used to be much less spin and tribalism, and people were kind of a little bit kind of more interested in results and what drives diseases and what the mechanisms might be. These days, there are so strong influence from funders, from different companies and conflicts of interest that it's really become difficult to navigate all these studies. So you need to have a good grasp on, and it takes a lot of experience of study reading actually, or you need to trust others who have this experience of study reading. I'm not really pointing to ourselves, but I think that we have more than 15K studies in our libraries. So we have read our part, or even more, definitely more than average studies. And I know that Mike is also a person who is a voracious reader of science, and I think that's the reason we have invited him to add comments. So I really would like you to remain skeptical, especially about associational studies, and especially if those are based on food frequency questionnaires, even if the results support your own biases or views. These are low quality publications, and some of these may be sufficient to generate hypotheses, but most are just utter junk. And always look for potential mechanisms. It's not enough to have some association that there is a 20% increased or decreased risk of whatever. What the mechanisms could be, and then look for mechanistic studies of basic science, and always think in evolutionary context. How does it make sense for humans, not only modern humans, but also humans 40,000 years ago, because that's when we kind of finalized our it's never finalized, but that's where our real evolution comes from, tens of thousands of years ago, and then we are now living in a so quickly changing environment that the context is really difficult to decipher. But if you look at what traditionally living people show us, for example, in connection with cardiovascular disease, how frequently they have it, and what the differences are, you can put all this into a context of common sense, basically, and it's extremely important to keep this common sense up. Yeah, thanks for bearing with us. And biology and context is extremely important to keep in mind. Always consider context. So if you hear a claim, ask back immediately in what context, because that's the best question you can ask. And if the person cannot answer anything about the context, then you know that there is some bias or spin behind.
Yeah, excellent, Gabor. And you've just exposed another charlatan, which is always nice to do. Myself and Gabor have been doing it for nearly a decade now. So, sorry, that's a little arrogant, but I feel strongly about this. So there we are. Gabor, you're still here. Mike, what do you reckon? I mean, we just did a Sue song, or a little tiny sliver, a slice of insight into the madness. Well, what's your thoughts?
Well, I pretty much agree with everything you guys said. You've got to be really careful with the confirmation bias, obviously, and we all have it, and that's probably one of the strongest biases around. And when we see something that we agree with, we automatically believe it without looking too deeply into it. If we see something we disagree with, we try to tear it apart. And and so I mean that's just human nature. But as far as so, it's just something that you always have to be aware of, and it's really difficult. And I work on myself all the time, and I've got as strong confirmation bias as anybody. So that's just a warning. You always have to be aware of that. In terms of these studies that you talked about, when just relating it to the world of studies in general, I mean the former editors of the New England Journal, of Lancet, of the British Medical Journal have all come out and said, the vast majority of research that you read sucks. It's funded by a lot of it by big pharma, and so it says what they want it to say, and people have all kinds of biases, and they end up getting papers published. And so the editors of these journals should know, and they, to a person, the three of them said, you really beware of the medical literature. And so what I do, when I see these studies like you guys have posted, and these way more in depth than I do, because if you say, a third of the medical research is good and 2/3 of it sucks, or even if half of it's good and half of it sucks, I'd rather spend my time trying to ferret out the good and delving into that and trying to learn something from that than I would trying to, go through and meticulously destroy some of these terrible studies. And so that's why I don't know that much about TMAO and the erythritol and the other one, because when I first looked at those, I could see that there were no mechanisms involved that I could understand. And that's what I always look at. I look at everything from an evolutionary basis first, and then I look at it from a mechanistic basis and say, well, does this make sense mechanistically? Would this really work mechanistically? What are the mechanisms involved? And then I'll look at also what they're looking at, like on the TMAO study. They have and I kind of did this innately, and I listened to a talk from a statistician the other day and found out that this is actually a fallacy. But that if you have, if you're trying to prove X equals Y, and that's what science is all about, is proving causality, not associations, but causality. And as you brought up, when you find an association, well, then you say, okay, well, if X and Y are together somehow, then you say, does X really cause Y? And that's what you want to find out. And so if in this case, with the TMAO study, for example, X is TMAO and Y is allegedly heart disease, but they don't use heart disease, they use a proxy. And they find all these little mechanisms, like it inhibits the ability to pull cholesterol out of the plaque. Well, that's not heart disease, that's a proxy. But then everybody just assumes it's heart disease. So you've really got to be careful with that. So when I noticed that and that, I said, and then you've got to look at the ideology of the people involved. And the first time I read about that was touted was by Chris Garner at Stanford, and he's a vegetarian. So of course he's going to promote something that is in keeping with his ideology. I mean, not everybody does that, but you've always got to be suspicious. And so that's kind of the way that I look at these things. But being always alert to the fact that I've got confirmation bias and that I believe in a meat diet and in a more, not a carnivore diet necessarily, although I don't think that's a bad diet, but in the carnivore end of the spectrum. And so I've got to kind of wash that bias out of myself when I look at these studies, and it's hard to do, but you've kind of got to do it. And it's just, you're better off, and to repeat myself, to try to find the good studies and delve into those and find out, what you can, that you can really learn from, that is causal, and use that instead of these, idiotic things like the ones that you talked about. And they always want to show, that whole grains are good. They always want to show that meat is bad, red meat is bad. They particularly want to show that processed meat is bad. And if you think about processed meats, for example, most people don't know this, but when you process meat in traditional ways, you make the protein more available. And a lot of people in underdeveloped countries, their diets are protein inadequate, and they don't have refrigerators. And so processing the meat actually gives them more protein than they would get out of the minuscule amount of meat that they have if it weren't processed. And I don't know why everybody's got it's against red meat, but that's just a bias that seems to be built into every one of these researchers. They always want to put in, those are the three things that they'll say: whole grains, red meat, and processed foods. And I just I do a weekly newsletter, and I just wrote in that about some of this a couple of days ago with the whole grains. I mean, has anybody tried to eat a whole grain? I ate one time in the back of my grandfather's pickup. There was some wheat in there, and I got the kernels out of one of the heads of wheat and plopped it in my mouth when I was just a kid. And I figured, bread's made of wheat, so if I eat the wheat, it'll be kind of like bread. You chew it and you chew it and you chew it and you chew it, and it turns out to be this white, slimy mass that you can't get rid of. I didn't want to swallow it. You can't break it down, and that's because of all the gluten in the wheat. And so that's a whole grain. So this whole idea of whole grains is idiocy, because any kind of grain that you're going to eat is going to be a processed grain. And they'll say refined grains are bad, whole grains are good. Nobody eats whole grains. And so it's anyway, the whole thing is really an exercise, at least to me, in picking out the good studies from the bad, eliminating the bad studies quickly and not spending a lot of time on them. And some of those are giveaway. Red meat's bad, whole grains are good, processed meats are bad. I mean, that doesn't mean I'll just reject them on that basis alone, but it means the probability is pretty high that I'll reject them, that they're going to follow a certain pattern when you get into the study. So I'd rather devote my time to studies that are really valid.
Absolutely, Mike. Well said. And it's funny, the bias, and I actually go after these studies in a way to make sure that I haven't missed something. So there's an element to that. And I remember back in 2012, 13, I was going after cholesterol. I did the cholesterol conundrum, and you were one of the first to approach me after that video. So thank you for that. But I was filling a folder. I made a folder called Fat is Bad, because I was so conscious of my potential bias as I began to be hugely convinced that the stuff about fat and cholesterol was nonsense. And because that was so kind of heretical an idea, but that's what the science was telling me, I said, oh, be very careful here. So I made a folder, Fat is Bad, and I put in the best studies that maintained, the paradigm of fat being bad. And I put them in that folder, and I was very careful to read them and look at them. And happily, after around 6 to 12 months, that folder had nothing in it that was credible. But I think it's a good exercise in a sense.
Well, yeah. And when you look at things from the viewpoint of evolution, as you mentioned earlier, both of you did in your little talk, it doesn't make sense that fat would be bad. It just doesn't make sense. I mean, we cut our teeth evolutionarily on a meat-based diet. I mean, nobody really disagrees with that. Now, there are some cultures that are extant today that have a higher carb diet, and they do okay. And it just shows that we can adapt to however, but basically we cut our evolutionary teeth on a meat-based diet. And when you go back all the way back to Australopithecus afarensis, and you start going from there, there's some great studies that show that two lineages diverged, and one was kind of a meat-eating lineage, and it went on to go through the Homo habilis, Homo erectus, all the way down through a bunch of other ones to Homo sapiens, and all those, the jaws got smaller, the teeth got smaller, because meat's basically easier to eat than roots, shoots, and crud like that. And so the other line broke off and went in a different direction, and it was a more vegetarian direction. And it's interesting because when you do the analyses of these two lines, the one that went in a vegetarian direction, actually the jaws and the skulls became more primitive, and the researchers couldn't figure out what was going on there, because when they did carbon dating on them, they were actually younger than their predecessors. And they thought, how can this be? How can they be getting more primitive? And it turns out they had to have these big jaws and big teeth to eat all this roughage and this plant food, and that line died out. So that was the evolutionary line that died out. That was Australopithecus robustus, and it just, because they were so big and robust, and it died out. And so we had this early experiment with vegetarianism that didn't work, and the one that was the meat-eating one worked, and we're the end result of that. And so anyone that says, oh, meat is bad for you, is kind of nuts. And what's interesting is, in my view anyway, is that if you look at Aboriginal populations, not just in Australia, but native populations everywhere, they eat nose to tail, so they end up getting a whole lot of fat that way, and they don't particularly savor the lean meats like we do. But our lean meats are fatter than their lean meats, and so modern agriculture has actually developed animals that have the fat inside the meat, so that we don't need to eat nose to tail. We can eat the steaks and the chops and the ribs and the other cuts that we like, and still get the fat that people get in Aboriginal societies eating nose to tail. So it's kind of an interesting thing when you look at it from the evolutionary perspective.
Yeah, Mike. And, of course, the organ meats are very fatty organs. So the really lean prey or game that the ancestors got, the organ meats gave them the extra fat. But I guess you could still say organ meats are still good for modern humans because of the nutrient density within them.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Right.
Hey, Gabor, I'll have to let you in here if you're still there. And just a quick one you might come in on. You mentioned, Mike, there about the processed meat, and I agree. The WHO studies on meat and as a carcinogen, I won't, we didn't even get into them here. They're so farcical, they're not even worth looking at. I mean, the hazard ratio is 1.1 or 1.2. They're all associational. And they left out a bunch of studies that went against their narrative. And it was in their list, but they wouldn't address them. It was comical. But the interesting thing is the processed meat they like to go after, because they seem to like to go after meat. And processed meat is an easier target because you're linking it to processed food. But Gabor was one of my great leading lights in teaching me one of the main problems with carbohydrates is the processing. You can process fat and you can process protein. It doesn't really make it bad, essentially. But if you process carbohydrates, you'll explode GIP hormone, you'll limit GLP-1. It's the processed carbohydrates that are the problem. And the indigenous peoples who ate 70% carbohydrates, they were not processed. And they didn't have vegetable oils, so they never got into the game of diabetes for those two reasons. What do you reckon, Gabor?
Yeah, I think this is also an area where really there is a lot of issues with the science available because people try to come up with categorizations. And you know how human mind works is that we tend to assign everything into a category. So this is processed, this is not processed, and what is actually processing? This is the first question when I'm asked. When I tell somebody that processed carbohydrates are a big problem in our diets, they ask, yeah, but what is processing? And I say that. In fact, as I have looked a lot into the mechanisms, I can come up with some explanations. But the real problem is that other people also came up with these categories, and there is this, for example, the NOVA system of food processing, which just muddies the waters because it's totally arbitrary. It's not based on real mechanisms, how processing can accelerate absorption of glucose or make available nutrients much sooner and much higher up in the digestive tract. They just come up with arbitrary things that squeezing fruits is not bad because it's minimal processing and then when you have more than 3 of some arbitrary additives in a food, then it's bad processing, it's ultra processing now. So the problem is that these are totally arbitrary and they don't go after any mechanisms. And I sometimes I'm really amazed that they find any associations because more often than not they still find some associations between the processing of foods based on their system and different diseases. So it's a miracle kind of that they still find some associations because these categories, their categories are totally not based on actual mechanisms. These are fundamentally arbitrary.
Yeah, that's it. And I always remember your crushed apples and apple juices versus whole apples. And I mean, the insulin and glucose spikes just from crushing the apples up and making juice. I mean, Coca-Cola wouldn't hold a candle to it. So that's real impactful processing. But these additives probably don't matter a toss. We can clear them, and they probably E numbers probably mostly don't matter too much. I'm not saying all. So you know what? I'm very conscious we're going way over time, and I want to get to some questions. So I might jump into that now and just scroll through the chat.
We have a raised hand by Tommy. I try to unmute and.
Hello, gentlemen. Thanks, Ivor, for this fantastic presentation. And moving swiftly on, my story is my wife was sick. She got a neurological issue. She was diagnosed with MS. MS is a neurological issue, as I just said, but it's the only way to diagnose it is through a differential diagnosis. So they get to that point by ruling out all the other illnesses. So it's not really a concrete diagnosis, and it's been a big lie, you know. So it's another pharma cover up, and I was able to find a way through diet to be able to reverse the symptoms, stop the attacks, which is basically doctors only give you treatment to prevent the attacks from happening, which is a steroid treatment every time you get a flare. and they don't really give you recovery options. But there is ways that you can actually remyelinate.
We can follow up offline, but to be honest, especially with Metabolic Duo, we're steering clear of all it's just gotten too toxic, that whole arena.
Oh,
so
100%.
Kind of sticking just with metabolic health, but
yeah,
absolutely offline, Tommy, for sure.
Gentlemen, that's all I really wanted to say, and I appreciate everything you guys are doing. Gabor, you're a gentleman, and I look forward to viewing this again offline.
Great stuff. Thanks, Tommy. And we'll get to another question, maybe kind of roughly related to the content. Just another thing as well before I forget. Dr. Eades here has got an incredibly good newsletter, the best newsletter I've come across. I've pumped it many times, The Arrow. So I'll put a link to that below. And a quick check, Mike, Protein Power 2 has been a while coming. It was the...
Yeah. 20 plus years coming. 20 plus years coming. So it's an update. It should be out later this year or early next year.
So not pre-order yet. There's no...
No, not yet. Gotcha. We're working on getting pre-orders set up.
Excellent. And the only other thing I'll quickly say before we get back to the questions, and Gabor, you might have a look there, is metabolicduo.com. Again, we're delighted. We got a load of people in at the start, and really appreciate if you share it, because 2 in-depth Zooms a month, not so much like this, knocking science, delving into the real science of health, decoding it, doing Q&A sessions, taking a lot of our time. So if you can help get that out there, or jump on board for the price of a couple of cups of coffee for a few hours of me and Gabor's time with the best science. Thank you. Gabor, any questions there you want to pull out from the list?
Yeah, we have one related is, can we go over our new website and product offering? How can we use this? So I think people need some assistance to have a look at the website, and how can they subscribe and what we offer.
Well, yeah, I know that sounds like a setup, but it's not. I guess someone asked that. If you go to metabolicduo.com, to be honest, we reasonably well described what's involved, what the offering is. We have no doubt it's the best value offering on the market. In fact, we kind of went out too low, but that's okay. And roughly speaking, it's 2 Zoom meetings per month where we go through a topic. We do a topic list. We have 10 broad topics already sent out to subscribers. We're setting up a voting system to prioritize the topics. And we're also going to be getting feedback, and I've got a lot already, on the level of depth. Our first inaugural Zoom meeting was on inflammation and cardiac disease. And generally, we hit it just right, but some people wanted an even simpler kind of takeaway. In fairness, simplified, people with very little kind of scientific type background, and some people did want a little more detailed. But we're going to continually put the customer first, direct what we cover twice a month, and in the Q&A sessions on feedback. And I think that's unique, and I'm not sure we can find a similar thing out there, especially at this ridiculously low price that's being offered. So that's kind of it. If you go to the website, last thing, there's a video there where I explain it all, and you can go through metabolicduo.com and see all the offerings, and they're pretty well laid out. Any other questions, Gabor? Or
we have Samir. I'm trying to unmute.
Or even just give the gist of the question at speed for the next 10, 15 minutes.
Greetings, gentlemen. Greetings, gentlemen. I won't be long. So just to say thanks again, it's been great. I'm an anthropologist based in Southern Africa, as well as being a low-carb health coach. And I just have a question for Professor Eades. So what I'm finding as I'm doing my research, Professor, is that many of the cultures that are more reliant on carbs, actually they have become reliant on carbs only in the very recent history. And I've looked, for example, at India, where I think colonial policies that forced people in India to get licenses for hunting and fishing and so on, that really ended what was used, so there's a tradition of sacrificing meat, sacrificing animals, and then that was given away as holy food. We call it prasad in India. So when it was no longer economical for them to do that, that's when you get sort of pure vegetarianism becoming dominant. So it's only in the last 150 years. So I'd love Professor Eades' comment on that. A question that may be too big for this, but something that I'd like someone to address at some point. I will be signing up for your excellent product, and I hope to join you guys on some future Zooms. But it's to do with LDL and Mendelian randomization, because when I listen to Attia and some of these guys, they go off about it. And for me, it's just it's a genetic association as opposed to a non-genetic association, but it's still just an associations and not causative. But they talk about it as if that's the nail in the coffin. And I'm an anthropologist, I'm not a statistician, so I don't know what the hell they're talking about really. If you could give a short response, that would be great. Thanks.
Excellent, Samir. Thanks so much. And I've heard the Mendelian randomization called Mengelian randomization because there's a nasty side to it. Gabor, you've been looking up this recently. I had a look at the time, and I was surprised to see that although they find an area or a codon on the genetic code that's linked between LDL, say, and heart disease, and they show if you have this genetic trait that you actually get more heart disease, and it's more like an RCT than an association. The problem is lots of other crucial stuff is right beside that on the DNA strand. And there's confounding within this Mendelian randomization too. But Gabor, give your thoughts.
I can only give general comments because I haven't looked into the LDL Mendelian randomization. In general, I'm not a big fan of this scientific method, especially not in biology and molecular biology, where there are very complex interactions, and you know that you can only get out what you have in the input data. So what happens is that I've used an example last time that I saw a study that claimed that interleukin-6 is not an important cause of cardiovascular disease. But how can this type of study consider context? So you have to know quite a lot about interleukin-6 biology to be able to provide a usable answer, because the problem is that, let's assume, this is an assumption, that interleukin-6 in the systemic circulation is not a problem, and interleukin-6 in the portal circulation is a problem when your visceral fat, in your abdomen, the belly fat, internal belly fat, releases this interleukin-6 and it reaches your liver directly, and this can cause metabolic disturbances, which then has an effect on your cardiovascular system. And there are more to it, even more to it, because there are at least two important types of interleukin-6 signaling. There is canonical, which means that it acts on your immune cells, and there is a so-called trans signaling, when these molecules are not attached to the cell surface anymore, but they start circulating and attach to a mobile receptor, so to say. And it's repeatedly only the trans signaling of interleukin-6 has been associated with metabolic diseases, including cardiovascular disease. So what if we have this interleukin-6 trans signaling in the portal system, which causes the real problems? This is an assumption, but I think I'm quite close. You have no way of seeing this with a Mendelian randomization, because this input data is not included. So if you have no data about the real cause, you are just playing around with different parameters, and you have absolutely no clue what you are doing.
And thanks, Gabor. And I think I recall that question there from Samir directed specifically to Mike, and then I went off. Do you remember, Mike? He specifically was asking you, was it more about the India and the...
Yeah, well, it was about recent societies taking to carbs. And at least as I recall, that's what it was. I had a little bit of a glitch. We've had bad weather here, and my internet isn't working as well as it should. And so I was had a little bit of static on that and couldn't hear it exactly, but I thought it was about people adapting to carbs way later on in the evolutionary cycle. And I don't know that they're really adapted, but they definitely switched to them then. Although there was a study that appeared in Nature, one of the Nature offshoots. They've got 1 million magazines now under the Nature banner, And this was, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, and it was about a society in Morocco that lived in caves. And these people were from 12 to 15,000 years ago. So that way predates agriculture by anybody's estimation. And this group ate primarily acorns, and they made everything out of them. You know, they found evidence that they made little cakes, and they made, they ground them up, and basically that's what they subsisted on. And they had absolutely atrocious teeth. The mouths that they showed in this article had, it was like an atlas of dental pathology. I mean, there were abscesses, there were cavities, there were everything that you could have go wrong with your teeth was wrong with these people who ate these sticky carbs. So definitely we did not evolve to eat sticky carbs. And when you find, when anthropologists find human remains, skeletal remains, what they typically, an anthropologist can tell really quickly if it was from a hunter-gatherer or an agriculturalist, because the hunter-gatherers, they're generally bigger, they've got greater bone density, they've got good teeth, they've got fewer signs of inflammation and infection. So it's pretty clear that we evolved on a basically meat-based diet. And when we moved into agriculture, it was kind of a devolution in human health. And so plenty of people can survive on them, but is that the optimal way? That's what you've got to ask yourself. Is do the Catawbans, who everybody seems to offer up as an example of a society that takes in a high-carb diet, well, they may do okay with it, but would they do better with a meat-based diet? My guess would be yes. You know, it goes back to my favorite economist / philosopher, Frederick Bastiat, that which is seen and that which is not seen. And the Catawbans, what is seen is what they're doing right now on a pretty high carb diet that's non-refined carbohydrates. But what isn't seen is how well they might be doing on a meat-based diet.
Yeah, that's a great point, Mike. And they might be, I don't know, 3 inches taller if they ate no processed food, no vegetable oils, unprocessed carbohydrate like plantains and all that, 70%. But they actually got more from meat, fish, and eggs and truly nutrient-dense ancestral foods. They could be bigger, stronger, faster, everything. But who knows?
Yeah.
And you know what occurs to me as well is the Okinawan story. So all the people who favor plant-based, Okinawans, but the studies show that the ones that reach over 100 centenarians, or I forget the term, none of them were vegetarian. So that's sub-selection of people who actually got over 100. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, when they looked at the Okinawan diet, it was after World War II, and they were all starving, and half of them had been killed.
Yeah.
And they had no pigs anymore because all the pigs were gone. But the pigs occupy a central place in their cuisine. The pig is revered. There was something like 0.7 pigs for each person. And then after the war, when they went in and looked at their diet, there were no pigs per person because they're all gone. And then within 10 years, they were back up to 0.4 or 0.5 pigs per person. I'm going from memory on the figures. So they jumped in and studied them at the most irrelevant and misleading point in their history. And then they started saying, hey, look, they don't eat meat much, and look, it's great. But they were also fasting per force, which is excellent for health and longevity.
Yeah.
So they were also forced fasting. I mean, the amount of scammery sometimes makes me get angry. Any other questions, Gabor? Are you looking there?
Yeah,
Sorry,
we have, I think, one last question. We can
we got to
give
move
that
on, guys.
to Anthony. I'm trying to unmute him.
Or even if it's written, if there's written ones.
Yeah,
We'll do this again,
unmuted.
guys, actually. This is good. Okay, I'll just pull out a question here. We got to wrap it now. We give it 3 or 4 more minutes, so we better wrap our half hour over. Norway have new nutrition advice, meat from 500 grams down to 350 gram a week. Oh my God, they're going to kill them. I don't even know what to say to that. Any more keto? I'm just looking for questions. There's a lot of comments. Brought to you by Pfizer. That was half an hour ago. I can't remember the context of that, as Gabor would say. Where do we sign up for the new membership? Oh, well, metabolicduo.com, yeah. Hi, Dr. Eades. Honor to be here with you. Absolutely. I started my diet health journey in 1997 with Protein Power, which is still the flagship book. I mean, I know there's good calories, bad calories, and all the politics. Protein Power basically laid it out straight what we're talking about here today. And but an update will be nice just the same.
The new one will even lay it out straighter.
Lay it out even straighter in these times of misinformation, right? We need to work even harder. Red meat. Oh, there's some negative comments about the push against red meat. Yeah, they're all positive. Lots of comments there. I see Dr. Eades, fantastic, blah, blah, blah. A lot of nutrients need to survive require meats, as most things are D3 or fat soluble. Yeah, no question. Liver is less than 2% of the entire cow. Yeah, but you got to get it. Salami. Information on calcium scores, that's a big topic, but we're going to be going through that metabolicduo.com along with myriad more topics. But CACRS, or calcification score, I mean, that's what I spent most time on the last few years. Yeah, to be honest, guys, we're running tight. Mike's got hard stop too. Listen, it was fantastic. Thanks so much for the huge response and sign up. And I've recorded this, so we'll redact maybe a little because of people's privacy and just leave us hardcore guys visible. Okay, thanks so much, everyone.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye.
So there you are, folks. Hope you really enjoyed that, as I did and Gabor did, and indeed Mike Eades. So we had a great time, and we're going to be doing this again on similar, really interesting topics. And as I mentioned during the actual video, metabolicduo.com, you can really help us by supporting. Join as a paid subscriber. You basically get 2 Zoom meetings with Q&A sessions with myself and Gabor on all aspects of nutritional and health science per month. And basically it's price of a cup of coffee per full Zoom meeting and presentation and Q&A that we put on. So it's the lowest price out there, best value out there by a mile. I'm pretty convinced of that. I think it speaks for itself. So metabolicduo.com, and watch out for free webinars for the public also in the coming weeks and months. Thank you.